My name is Kara Fielding. I'm 31, a quality control supervisor at a medical device factory in Central Ohio. And until that day, I thought I understood what workplace stress looked like. But nothing prepared me for the moment I pulled open the storage room door and nearly dropped from the blast of heat that hit me in the face. I remember the sound first. Not voices or machines, but this eerie silence under the steady hum of the emergency light. The air was heavy, like stepping into a furnace. Then I saw her, curled up against the wall, barely moving her uniform, clinging to her like wet paper, her hair soaked through and stuck to her skin. Nina. At first, I didn't even recognize her. She looked like she'd been in there for days. Her mouth opened and a cracked voice came out, barely a whisper. She reached for me with shaking fingers, and I dropped to my knees, pulling the water bottle from my bag with clumsy hands. I kept asking how long she'd been there, but she couldn't get the words out right away. The digital thermometer on the wall said 105. I touched her arm and it was burning. I'm not being dramatic when I say it felt like touching a stovetop. My hands were shaking as I held her up. She gulped the water like someone drowning. I remember looking around and realizing the room had no vents, no windows, just shelves stacked with product and one heavy metal door. She finally croaked out that she'd been sent in there the night before, 17 hours ago. I couldn't process that. I just kept thinking, how does someone get left like this in a building full of people? How did nobody notice? That's when she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes locked on the door and she said it wasn't a mistake. She'd found something, showed it to someone high up, and then, somehow she ended up here, locked in a heat trap like garbage someone forgot to take out. I didn't know what to believe. I just knew I had to get her out. And that's where everything began to unravel. Getting Nina out of that room was harder than I expected. Her legs buckled the moment she tried to stand. I had to wrap her arm around my shoulders, half dragging her through the corridor, sweat from both of us soaking into my clothes. Her skin felt like it was on fire, and her breath came in short, shallow gasps. Every few feet, she'd mutter something I couldn't understand. I just kept whispering that we were almost there, even though I didn't believe it myself. The air outside that metal door felt like a miracle, but it wasn't cool. It was just less suffocating. I flagged down a security guard, but he only radioed for permission to let us through. That's when I realized she'd been trapped in a place where no one was allowed after hours. No one would have checked. No one even knew she was there. She wasn't just forgotten. She was erased. At urgent care, the nurse took one look at her and rushed us past the line. They got her on fluids immediately. Her vitals were unstable, and the attending said another hour in that room could have pushed her into heat stroke or worse. The way he said worse made my stomach twist. I stepped outside to catch my breath and realized I was shaking. This wasn't just an accident. It couldn't have been. When I went back in, Nina's color was better, but she looked hollow. Her eyes were open, though, and they found mine fast. She whispered my name like it was something heavy she needed to lift. Then she told me everything. Not all at once. Bits and pieces at first, strung between long pauses where she caught her breath or sipped water. She said she'd been reviewing inspection reports for our latest batch of pediatric ventilators. Something didn't sit right. She found test logs that showed equipment failures, but the official reports had been altered, passed when they should have failed. Critical safety checks skipped. She brought it up with her manager, and when he brushed her off, she sent the documents higher, directly to Gavin. That was 3 days ago. She paused, then looking toward the wall like she was watching it happen all over again. The next day, Gavin asked her to re-inventory the storage room, told her it was time-sensitive and she'd need to work past her shift. She went in. The door shut. Then she heard it click. She waited for a laugh or a call on the intercom, something to show it was just a mistake, but nothing came. The lights dimmed. The heat pressed in like a fist. Her phone had no signal inside. She screamed until her throat gave out. She pounded on the door until her knuckles bled. No one heard her. No one came. I sat there listening, trying to keep my own breathing steady. I wanted to believe this was some kind of misunderstanding, that maybe the door had jammed or someone forgot she was inside, but I couldn't ignore what she had just told me. She threatened to expose a safety violation that could get someone hurt or killed. And the next day, she was locked in a metal box during a record heat wave. She closed her eyes and whispered that Gavin smiled when she handed him the report. Not fake friendly, not professional. Just a small curl at the edge of his mouth, like he already knew how this would end. She said it felt like he was telling her she'd just made her last mistake. I wanted to scream. I wanted to go back to the building and demand answers. But all I could do was sit there trying to process the fact that our company, the one I'd spent 6 years working for, might have just tried to bury someone alive for telling the truth. And the worst part was knowing how easy it would have been to get away with it. If I hadn't come in early. If I hadn't checked that hallway. If I hadn't pulled that door open. They never expected anyone to care enough to look. The next morning, I walked Nina back into the building to grab her things. She didn't want to go alone. Her hands still shook. We kept our heads down, moving through the hallway like ghosts, hoping no one would notice us. But he did. Gavin came around the corner just as we reached the break room. His expression didn't change. Not even a flicker of surprise. Just that cool, practiced calm, like running into someone at a grocery store. He stopped, adjusted his tie, and asked why Nina was out of the storage room. His voice was smooth, controlled, just slightly louder than necessary. She was supposed to be checking inventory, wasn't she? I felt my jaw clench, but I said it anyway. She'd been locked in. All night. The room had no airflow. No one found her because no one was allowed back there after hours. She was barely conscious when I opened that door. He nodded slowly, as if I had just given him the weather forecast. There must be some mistake, he said. The doors don't lock from the outside. She probably got turned around, maybe knocked something loose trying to leave. Accidents happen. He glanced at Nina, who hadn't spoken a word. Her knuckles were white against the strap of her bag. When she finally looked up and said he locked her in, his eyes narrowed, but the smile didn't fade. That's a serious accusation, Kara, he said, turning toward me like I was the one who'd misspoken. Something like that could have consequences for everyone involved. His meaning wasn't subtle. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Nina reached for my arm. I could feel her shaking again, but her grip was steady. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I was still trying to understand how he could stand there and pretend it was nothing. How could he smile while she looked like a survivor pulled from rubble? Then the shift changed. 2 other employees stepped into the hallway. Gavin straightened, cleared his throat, and the performance began. Nina wasn't feeling well. He was just checking in. I should take her to urgent care. He'd have the paperwork ready when we returned. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. I could feel his eyes on us the entire way out. That stare didn't just follow, it pushed, pressed, warned. The kind of look you feel between your shoulder blades long after you've left the room. In the parking lot, Nina turned to me and whispered, "Thank you." I told her not to. The truth was, I didn't know what to do next. I wasn't sure who I could trust. Gavin had denied it so easily, so smoothly, that for a split second I almost doubted what I knew. Almost. But the way his smile never quite reached his eyes, the way he said my name was like a promise or a threat. That stayed with me. He wanted us to be quiet. He expected silence. And he thought a little pressure would be enough to make us fold. I dropped Nina off at home and drove around for over an hour, windows down, not feeling the wind. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying every second of that hallway encounter. The smile, the lie, the veiled threat. It didn't feel like an accident anymore. It felt like a warning. And somewhere deep in my gut, that warning began to rot into something else, something like fury, something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. For a while, it felt like we were the only ones who knew. Nina carrying this terrible truth while everyone else just smiled and kept working. But something shifted that week. People started looking at us differently. Not with suspicion, with recognition. Quiet nods in the break room. Someone slipped a sticky note into my locker that said simply, "I believe you." Then one evening, as we were leaving late, a janitor named Miguel approached us near the back lot. He'd worked there for over a decade, mostly nights. Always quiet, always invisible. But that night, his eyes were sharp, watchful. He said he'd heard what happened, and that it wasn't the first time. I didn't know how to respond, but Nina did. She asked him what he meant, and he pulled a notebook from his coat. It was thick pages, worn and crinkled. He'd been keeping track for 2 years. Equipment failures, near-miss accidents. Workers were written up for reporting safety issues. Even one case where a woman suffered chemical burns after being told to ignore a leak. He said nobody cared. He tried reporting it once. His hours got cut for months afterward, so he started documenting. Quietly, patiently, waiting for someone to care enough to ask. We stood there in the dark under the hum of a flickering lamp, flipping through page after page of proof. It wasn't just us. This was a pattern. A machine built to silence anyone who asked too many questions. And suddenly the weight I'd been carrying alone didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. I looked at Nina. She nodded once slowly as if something had clicked. There were more of us out there. Maybe not ready to speak, but ready to listen. And maybe that was enough to start something. I walked back to my car with the notebook pressed against my chest. My hands were sweating, but my heart felt steadier than it had in days. We weren't alone. We just needed to find the others. And when we did, we'd have more than a story. We'd have a case. And maybe, just maybe, a way to fight back. We knew we couldn't go through the usual channels. HR was a dead end. The state board was too slow. And Gavin had a talent for making problems disappear before they got too loud. If we wanted people to listen, we needed more than words. We needed them to feel it. That's when the idea came. It started as a joke, actually. Miguel said, "What if we just turned off the AC at the safety conference and let them sweat like Nina did?" We all laughed. Then we got quiet. Then someone asked, could we actually do that? Turns out we could. Nina had worked in compliance long enough to know the layout of the building. The cooling system ran through rooftop towers with a central transformer exposed behind a privacy fence. In the July heat, that setup was already running on the edge. Add just a little stress to the system and it would trip, not permanently, just enough to make the building feel exactly like that storage room, enough to make them understand. We found a few reflective panels in the maintenance shed, the kind used for solar temp tests. If we positioned them just right, the sunlight would focus directly on the transformer housing. With the forecast showing 95 degrees on conference day, we didn't need sabotage. Just physics. And maybe a little poetic justice. The plan was risky. If someone caught us, we'd be fired. If it didn't work, we'd be dismissed as dramatic. But if it did, every regulator, reporter, and industry bigwig would get a front row seat to the truth. Not in theory. Not in a memo. In sweat. In red faces and stuck suits and rising panic. We didn't want revenge. We wanted understanding. So we built a plan not to destroy but to reveal. They ignored what happened to Nina because they couldn't see it. Couldn't feel it. We'd change that. As the pieces came together, I felt something shift. Not just anger anymore. Something sharper. Something focused. We were finally doing something. And for the first time since that door slammed shut on Nina, we were the ones in control. By noon, the sun was merciless. The forecast had promised 95, but the pavement outside the conference hall felt closer to 100. Inside, 300 attendees sat in suits and business dresses under soft lights and banners that read words like innovation and integrity. Gavin was making rounds, shaking hands, laughing in that polished, practiced way that made my skin crawl. Then it happened. Right on schedule, the transformer failed. It didn't explode or smoke. It just stopped. The hum of the AC vanished, like someone had yanked the plug from a wall. Within minutes, the air grew thick. Fans cut off. Doors stayed closed. Sweat began to bead on foreheads. People loosened collars, shifted in their seats. The first person to crack was a vendor who walked out to get air. Then another followed. Then 10 more. Outside, we were ready. Miguel had set up cooling stations just across the street. Tables lined with cold water bottles, battery-powered fans, shade tents. But that wasn't all. As the first wave of flushed, confused guests stumbled out of the building, we handed them packets, neatly organized files. Photos, logs, names, proof. You could see it happen. Their brows furrowed as they read. Some sat down, flipping pages. Some stood still, blinking, stunned. Sweat running down their backs as they stared at inspection reports marked failed, then changed to pass. Images of melted equipment chemical burns and emergency room admissions. A full medical record from Nina's night in the heat, time-stamped. Verified. I stood off to the side and watched it unfold. There were no raised voices, no protests, just a realization, a wave of it spreading from table to table. These people had come to learn about workplace safety. Now they were learning how easily it could be faked, how silence could be bought, and how quickly a company like ours could bury the damage. Some of them looked back toward the building like they were seeing it for the first time. Not as a clean glass office, but as the box it really was. The same kind that almost killed Nina. And for the first time since this all began, I saw Gavin's name written on someone else's lips. Not in praise, in disbelief, in anger, in something dangerously close to justice. The moment felt surreal. Gavin stood near the entrance, his shirt stained with sweat, trying to maintain control as the crowd outside thickened. He barked orders into a phone, pretending the building's heat was just a fluke. But his eyes kept darting, scanning the faces now turning toward him not with admiration, but with suspicion. Then the murmur began. First quiet, then louder. Words like forged reports and whistleblower. People who had once applauded him now backed away. And just as Gavin turned to head back inside, the police cruiser pulled up. 2 state officers stepped out, cameras turned, microphones raised. Gavin froze. Nina stepped forward from the crowd. Her face was calm, but her eyes burned. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The moment she said his name, the entire crowd hushed. Gavin tried to smile to dismiss her with that same practiced charm, but it fell flat. She called him out. For the door, for the reports, for everything. He denied it, claimed it was all a setup, said the evidence was fake, manipulated by bitter former employees. That's when the officer held up a copy of the footage. Surveillance from the storage hallway, time-stamped, audio included. Gavin's hand is turning the key. His voice told Nina to stay put. The color drained from his face. He stammered something about legal teams and internal processes. But no one was listening anymore. The crowd didn't move. Reporters filmed. Inspectors took notes. Nina didn't flinch. The officers cuffed him. He didn't resist. But as they turned him toward the car, his eyes locked with Nina's. There was no apology, no guilt. Just fear. Because for the first time, the system he'd used to control others had turned against him. I watched Nina hold that gaze until the door shut. Then she turned to the crowd, her shoulders still. It wasn't a victory speech. It didn't need to be. Her presence was enough. She'd survived what he tried to erase. And now everyone saw it for what it was. Not an accident, not a misunderstanding, a lie. And now the man behind it had a face, a name, and a pair of handcuffs. The fallout was fast. Within days of the conference, the state opened a full investigation into the company. Inspectors swept through the facility with warrants and clipboards. Files were seized. Servers mirrored. Gavin wasn't the only one they found at fault. 2 executives resigned before they could be questioned. The rest were placed on leave pending review. It wasn't just internal policy violations. There were signs of criminal negligence, tampering with safety logs, supplying faulty equipment to hospitals and clinics, ignoring repeated reports of system failures. When news outlets picked up the story, it spread like wildfire. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to Nina, to me, to Miguel. People who had been invisible for years now had names and voices. Nina stayed grounded through it all. She gave one interview and then stopped. She said she didn't want her trauma to become someone else's headline. But she did give a statement when the state legislature passed the Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act, a direct result of what we'd uncovered. A new safeguard for workers who dared to speak up. It was the first time in years that the law had been updated, and they named it after us. I was offered a job on the new State Safety Oversight Board. At first, I wasn't sure I wanted to accept. It meant more attention, more responsibility. But then I thought about all the people who'd helped us, people who couldn't fight back, people who didn't make it. And I said yes. Nina moved to North Carolina to be closer to her sister. Her son Adam got a full scholarship. He wrote his college essay about what his mother survived. He called it resilience. I still get emails from him sometimes. Mostly photos, a textbook, a campus bench, the first snow. Sometimes I walk past the old building just to remind myself that it really happened. It looks the same from the outside. Same glass doors, same lettering above the main entrance, but everything inside is different now. Leadership changed, culture changed, and most importantly, people started watching. It wasn't just us. Our story gave others the push to come forward. Within 6 months, the Oversight Board received dozens of new reports. Some were small infractions. Others were worse. Patterns. Cover-ups. The kind of rot that spreads quietly until someone shines a light on it. That's what we did. We didn't burn the place down. We lit it up. Made sure the shadows had nowhere left to hide. I still think about how close we came to letting it go. How easy it would have been to stay silent. To move on. To convince ourselves it wasn't our problem. But silence is exactly what people like Gavin count on. They count on fear, on fatigue, on the idea that no one will believe you, or worse, that no one will care. But they're wrong. Because someone always does. And sometimes that someone finds someone else. And before you know it, you've got a chain strong enough to break through anything they built to keep the truth out. If you're watching this and you've been made to feel small or scared for doing the right thing, I want you to know something. You are not alone. The system isn't perfect, but it's not unchangeable. And you don't need an army to shift it. Sometimes all it takes is one cracked door, one moment of light. We didn't just survive, we changed the game. Not because we were powerful, but because we were stubborn, because we refused to disappear. So if you ever find yourself staring down someone like Gavin, remember our story. Remember what came after the silence. Speak anyway, stand anyway, even if your voice shakes. Because the moment you do, everything starts to change. And that's where justice begins, not in courtrooms or headlines, but in someone like you saying, this stops here, this stops now.